Hey everybody, welcome to Good Game Design is Accessible. We are four game designers and we're about to fill you with knowledge and information on how we design with accessibility in mind. I'm Carol Mertz. I am a senior game designer at Exploding Kittens, where I make party games, board games for a living. So you can find a lot of my games on store shelves at places like Target and Walmart. Why don't we go ahead and move on to Chris, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hey, yeah, I'm Chris King, creative director of Battery Staple Games. We make crunchy, crisply controlling action games that you can play and replay, hopefully with a buddy if you want to. We just finished making 30XX on Steam and on Switch. It's kind of a co-op roguelike Mega Man-ish kind of game. We made a very similar kind of game with less expertise, 20XX before that. You cannot find our games on store shelves because we haven't done physical yet, but hey, maybe someday soon. So for now, you can find us on Steam and on Switch, and yeah.
My name is Drew McCrory. I am the lead accessibility designer for Diablo 2. I've been in the games industry for a couple of decades now. Prior to this, I was the accessibility lead for Diablo 2 Resurrected, which was taking a crunchy game from 20 years ago and trying to make it accessible, which was pretty interesting. But it was a bunch of learnings that I got to bring over to Diablo 4, which right now is probably one of the more accessible ARPGs in the market, which I'm super proud of.
My name is Adam Oliver. I'm a senior combat designer at Sony's Santa Monica studio, most recently having shipped God of War Ragnarok, a character action game with RPG elements and narrative focus. I helped with boss and enemy design, as well as helping make the combat more accessible for players with disabilities.
Amazing. I'm so honored to be on a panel with all of you guys. This is going to be so much fun. The way that I think we should kick this off, just to kind of give folks a baseline idea of the sorts of things that we're going to be talking about, is I want to give folks an idea of what does good accessible design look like. So what are some examples of games, whether you worked on them or whether you've seen them and played them, what are some examples of games that really harness accessible design really well and successfully?
I mean, we can always talk about The Last of Us. I am completely in awe with their ability to basically completely change their game based on what the end user needs. Being able to completely bypass the puzzle sections or completely augment, AI population and AI behavior based on cognitive needs. It is the staple that I think everybody is working towards. But I also think it's important to know that it's still not perfect. And accessibility is still a very burgeoning field in general when it comes to game media. So we're always learning how to do things better.
I come around personally as somebody playing a lot and making a lot of 2D games, action games in the indie space. I think a lot about Celeste as kind of the game that sort of broke the doors wide open for developers of size like me. By sort of broaching that topic of, do assist modes in really challenging games, do anything that cheapen the sort of challenge level of these kinds of experiences? Do they do anything that sort of interferes with the feelings of satisfaction inherent in those really tense, excellent challenges with a, resounding no? Obviously, they don't interfere with that kind of feeling of success and triumph whatsoever. They really set a standard in my eyes for that kind of game. We also look at Dead Cells a lot for some of this too. They have a very similar, really crunchy kind of action platformer that has all of these lovely both assist and accessibility options that make the game playable for players both of all skill levels, but they also have all sorts of fascinating visibility options that help players see exactly what they're trying to see, hear exactly what they want to hear, and so forth. I think they've done a lovely job, and they set pretty solid guidelines for developers like me to follow.
Cool. As a combat designer, I'm often looking at what makes combat good and seeing a lot of the intersections between what makes the design accessible. I'm looking at multiple types of feedback for what's going on in the game. When I look at games like Sekiro or Ghosts of Tsushima, attacks have video or visual and audio tells. So players, if they have a disability that prevents them from engaging in one of these systems, they're going to be covered because those moves are actually communicated in multiple ways, and that's like a really fun foundational aspect of accessible design, is making sure that design and the important information is being communicated to the player in multiple ways. I often also look at an example like Devil May Cry 5, the skill shop. The player is capable of utilizing the skill they're thinking of purchasing before they've purchased it against an AI in a consequence and judgment-free area. And this is like a great option for people that might have a cognitive load of making that decision. What do I buy with my resources, or how do I get used to my controls of this new ability? That's a really great example of accessible design in like the character action space.
That's really interesting. And I like that you're like thinking of it from, you know, your perspective as a combat designer. You're thinking specifically from that approach. And like, you know, elephant in the room, I am the only person designing, you know, physical games here. And so like a lot of people don't know or have a clear idea of what does accessible design mean in board games. And it's still being heavily explored, honestly. There's very few of us who are like creating documentation and creating resources for this, but I can say that there's a few really interesting, very uniquely accessible games. And like, because, you know, it's so hard to create these modifications for board games the way that, you know, you can have so many different settings in a video game that can change so much about it. With board games, it's very much like house rules and stuff. So the accessible designs that we're seeing are kind of focusing on usually a specific accessibility need. So for example, Access Plus by Asmodee is making really interesting strides toward cognitive accessibility by remaking, they're remaking games like Timeline and Spot It or Dobble, if you're familiar with those, which are sort of mass market games that require a lot of, you know, fast movement and memory, and they're working with specialists to ensure that these remakes are specifically accessible to people with cognitive accessibility needs, which I think is really cool. But that's like from the approach of designing specifically for accessibility with, you know, around those particular needs. But another example that I really like to talk about is Nyctophobia by a designer called Catherine Stipple, who she has an uncle who is blind, and was like, there aren't any board games that I can think of that I can comfortably play with my uncle. And so she decided to design a tactile game that is designed to be played while wearing blackout glasses. And so this is, you know, one of the first games, and it's one of the most often talked about games in the accessibility space, because it is one of the first games that was specifically designed to be accessible to players who are unsighted. And so I think it's a really interesting approach. And we actually referenced it a lot when I was working on my game Hand to Hand Wombat alongside Corey O'Brien, who was the designer of that game, where like that is a game. Yeah. Sorry, I noticed Adam giggling. Yeah, the name is very silly.
Very good.
Hand to Hand Wombat.
Very good.
It's about stacking blocks. And if you know anything about wombats, wombats poop blocks. So you can put that together. But the idea is that the entire game is played with your eyes closed. And so we designed that game knowing that, and knowing that it would be accessible, or we could potentially be accessible. And we, you know, designed it toward accessibility for unsighted play, which was really exciting. So that said, I mean, that kind of segues us really well into our next subject, which is how do we, as designers, how do we approach even coming up with concepts? You know, we talked about Catherine Stipple, who knew that she wanted to design for a specific, you know, accessibility need. How do we as designers come up with our concepts from an accessibility first mindset?
I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to education and empathy to everybody that's designing, right? You know, accessibility in game media is a very burgeoning field still. We're all trying to be better, because it was not front in anybody's mind even 5 to 10 years ago, right? So when we talk about, hey, let's make a game that's more accessible, well, if the game is just really well designed, it's already going to be more accessible. So we teach, you know, people what makes a game accessible or what the needs of our users are. And then as we design systems, you know, in those really crucial initial stages, and we start taking things into account, we end up with a better overall game, but also a game that more players can come in and enjoy. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to do as a designer, right? Like, you want players to come in and play all the cool things that you've made. So if we're not making a game that anybody can just come in and play, we're doing it wrong. I always say, in my big line, and I'm sure people in my office are obnoxious or feel like I'm obnoxious with it. I'm like, but the only reason somebody shouldn't play one of our games is because they're not interested in the concept of the game, not because they can't play the game.
Yeah. And I mean, it's what you said, I think, rings to the name of the panel, right? Good game design is accessible. Accessibility captures so many different needs and so many different people in so many different situations that, like, just creating a game with a good player experience and thinking about where those barriers are and where you can help either remove or lessen some of those barriers while maintaining your vision and your goal with the game, like, that's good game design. Whether whether you're thinking about it being accessible or not, that is simply what good game design is is thinking about your players, right?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to piggyback off of a couple of the concepts here. Drew kind of mentioned like the empathy for the player. I think this is like a really strong point to make because I think a lot of design is about being empathetic to the player experience and like what different players in their motivations might be like. Like we're often thinking about players that want or are interested in different things when we're trying to build a design that's has broad appeal that can be played by multiple people and enjoyed. And if we pull in accessibility into that empathy, being like, what's the player experience to what Kara was saying? What's the player experience like for a player that has a disability? Like, what's the experience like if they only have one hand? What's the experience like if they have they have low vision, and does the concept for the game work for that kind of player, and what might be needed to make that work? That's kind of a lot of the things that I keeps me up at night. And I think another point to make is that like what Drew is saying is like this is kind of like a burgeoning field, which means that a lot of the knowledge we have around accessibility is changing. It's changing year to year, and these games are typically made on a really long project length. So that means like a well-intentioned misunderstanding early on can have a pretty big impact on the playability of a game. So one of a really important thing to do is try to stay up to date. Be like, okay, well, this is changing. I'm going to be staying up to date on what the accessibility learnings have been, and trying to teach the other people on your team, and because those misunderstandings can really have a big impact.
Yeah, we're in a very similar.
We'll definitely.
Sorry, go ahead, Carol.
Sorry, I think we're definitely going to dive more into that later too. So I want to put a pin in that idea of like, teaching your team and working with your team and doing more research. But go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. From a concept perspective, sort of conceptually, we want to be in the exact same spot that Drew is, where we want to make sure that everybody who finds our game interesting, either because they like the theming, the moment-to-moment gameplay, the visuals, the music, anything that draws them in, we want them to be able to enjoy it. But of course, as a very small indie, we're also working within a pretty heavily constrained resource budget. All of 30XX was pretty much built by about 1.5 engineers, depending on where in the life cycle you want to sort of pin down that number. So for us, for the most part, actually during the sort of concept and early design process, we're trying our best to just try and stay out of our own way. We don't want to make any decisions that are going to prevent us from being able to add accessibility down the line, because we're really, like so many other things we did while making 30XX, we spent like 2.5 years, something like that, in early access before 1.0, just about 6 weeks ago or so. And like so many other things we do, we're really listening to the community. We're very deeply embedded in our own game community. We're listening to every single comment made in our Discord, every single post made on our Steam community, which, thank God, has been very, very pleasant and non-toxic for pretty much the entirety of our company's existence, which I know makes us a little bit unicornish, which we are endlessly thankful for. I'd rather be lucky than good any day of the week. But we're so carefully listening to the community with what specific needs we could meet better, because as much as we'd love to say, here is every last little accessibility option or difficulty toggle or assist mode or visibility thing we could possibly add to the game, the truth is that we could do all of those things, and it would also take us another 1.5 years to do all of them in the time we could have shipped a whole nother game. And our audience, compared to like perhaps a God of War Ragnarok or a Diablo 4 is small enough that the business case isn't going to be there for every single one. And so we're just very carefully listening to our community for all of the potential pain points for like where somebody will come in and say, I absolutely love the way this game looks, sounds, plays, but I can't get past X or Y or Z. All of that said, there are still like, conceptually we still try and solve a few of those things out. I think I may be digging into a later topic that we're going to dig into, so I'm going to cut a little bit of that short. But for us, it's very much the exact same. We want to make this accessible as possible, but I don't have a lot of money. So how do I do that?
Yeah, and I love that. It's, again, as designers, a great designer is listening to their players. A great designer, the most successful designer, is thinking about people outside of themselves and thinking about the experience of like so many different possible player experiences, right? And that is such a huge part of our jobs. That, like, an example of kind of a concept, like working from concept as opposed to tacking it on at the end, which I think we mentioned a little bit. Like, so many games feel very much like the accessibility was tacked on at the end, and it feels very much like an afterthought, right? And at least, it's better than nothing, I'm sure, but it doesn't feel integrated. It doesn't feel meaningful in the same way. And so, from a board game perspective, I have to acknowledge that, like, because of the nature of board games, because these are physical components, these are custom, these are, this is very much a physical play space, it's very hard, nay impossible, to make any board game accessible to every single person. But what we can do, like I mentioned earlier, is think about those barriers right from the start and think about what are the likely barriers that my players are going to have, and how can I remove those barriers? And so for an example of that, where we thought about this from the concept, from the very, very first stages, is this challenge game that we just released called Without Fail, where this is this kind of very physical game where we've got cups and we've got balls and we've got pieces of paper and we're running around the room and we're trying to catch the balls and the cups. And it's every single challenge is different. Every single challenge is unique. And some of them involve all of that physical activity and some of them don't. And when we saw that, we said, when we're playtesting, we obviously have players who have mobility conditions who cannot get up and do these physical activities, but they can still enjoy this game with these seated activities. How can we communicate to them and think about them and show them that we're thinking about them? How can we communicate to them that this game is still something that they can approach? And so we added an icon on every single card, so that before they ever even play that card, they can identify whether this particular challenge is going to make them have to stand up and move around. And if they can't, for whatever reason, stand up and move around in that moment, they can easily skip that card without having to go through the setup process, without having to get really excited about what could this possibly be when they turn over the challenge and learn about it. We miss all of that, like, sort of deflation of, oh, turns out I can't actually do it. And now we're creating this opportunity for them to feel empowered to say, well, we don't need to do that. Let's do this one, because I can stay exactly where I'm at and I can still play the game just as it was designed and I can still have a great time. And, like, that's the kind of thing that I think is really important to think about, where even just one little thing, like adding an icon, like, the game didn't change. It's not fundamentally different just because we added that icon, but it is fundamentally different to those players, right?
I really love that, Carol.
So, yeah, thank you. I'm very proud of, like, the way that we've started thinking about that process, right? Like, and that's, that is an example of accessibility by design, right? Whereas accessibility through options, where, in board games, that's house rules. We will still play, for example, we'll still play the ones where we stand up, but we'll change it in some way so that we can play it while we're still sitting down, and it's going to be, we're going to be in our chairs and we're going to hold our cups and we're still going to throw it at each other and we're just going to send this sprightly little kid after the ball when it runs away, right? That's a house rule and that's totally fine. But that's an option. That's not necessarily designed into the game. So clearly that process is going to be different from board games to video games. Do we want to, like, let's kind of talk a little bit about what that looks like, the accessible design by design in the design process from our perspective as the game designers. How are we thinking about accessibility as we're creating the mechanics, as we're designing this player experience, versus that big option menu, that big list of recommendations for, you know, for accessibility needs, you know, things like this. Where do you draw the line? What's the difference? You know, how are you differentiating this process?
For us, I think my general attitude is, you know, solve as much accessibility via design as you can comfortably, and then use options for the overflow is kind of our general take. So 20XX and 30XX are both roguelites. To be pedantic about it with the T instead of the K, because I know that my fans will yell at me if they watch this and they use the K. Meaning every time you play through the game, you know, you get a series of levels. If you are killed at, you know, any point in the run, you'll go all the way back to the beginning of the game. Maybe you'll get to have a couple of unlocks, and then you'll start all over. There are a whole bunch of people that love these, who are also very heavily Mega Man-ish inspired game. And so thankfully we've done a good enough job of that there are a lot of players that look at our game and they say, oh, that's a Mega Man thing. I want to play that. That looks fantastic. And then say, oh, it's also, you know, I die and it's got this really harsh, you know, sort of, you know, you get reset up to an hour kind of loop. I hate that. And so as a design thing, and maybe it can be argued whether or not this is actually a design or an option, in our sequel. So in the first game, we just had kind of the roguelike mode, and that's all we has to it. But in the sequel, we built out an entire second mode that we call Mega Mode, where it sort of apes that kind of traditional level on level stakes level, instead of having an entire run at once, where instead of having a, you know, you basically play through as far as you can make it through however many levels, you die, you go back to HQ. Instead, we generate the entire run up front, place all of the items, bosses, powers, all that cool stuff immediately. And then when the player starts playing, they have this different sort of level select interface that looks a little more like a classic Mega Man game might. And every time you die in one of those levels, you simply return to HQ. The rest of the campaign is still intact. You can try levels in whatever order you want. Basically kind of removing that permadeath stakes from the game in the first place. But there are also a ton of places where, you know, because we're making this, you know, crisply controlling action game where, like, you know, 90% of the long-term playability of the game is in hitting the right tension level for the player, hitting that sort of sweet flow state spot where, you know, the player knows that if they don't play pretty darn well, they are going to fail and be back to square one, but not so white knuckle tense that they feel like they're going to have a heart attack every time I put down the controller. And, you know, the number of people who want to come and play your game is so broad, so diverse in terms of ability and skill level, that there is no single, like, you know, short of really quickly learning, super well executed adaptive difficulty, which is, you know, if I were going to spend all of my time doing that, I probably should be doing that for a much larger company instead of doing it on my own. So instead, we have, you know, really robust sort of difficulty options that are sort of intended as a, you know, players that finish the game will turn up these sort of individual, very, very modular toggles to sort of turn up the difficulty, but also on the back end, a really solid assist mode too, that changes a whole bunch of kind of the game's difficulty levers in the player's favor, so that if somebody sits down and sort of gets their butt kicked 2 or 3 times in a row and says, you know, wow, this really isn't for me, there's this huge backdrop for them to kind of explore before they say, you know, I don't really think this is something I can do. So for us, I think that's at least one example of something that we try to solve via design versus something we do via options.
I love that.
Yeah, that's really awesome. You know, and again, it's a super murky thing with video games, right? You know, when we talk about accessibility by design, you know, versus options, you know, finding that balance is really tricky. So like right now on Diablo 4, we have, I think, a little bit more than 50 accessibility options. You know, but we also know from all of our telemetry that there's just options that if we default to on, players never turn them off, right? Like any video game right now that ships without subtitles enabled is bonkers in my mind, because like 90-something% of users will not disable subtitles if they're defaulted to on, which means that subtitles are enhancing those players' experience. So yeah, let's just give them subtitles on. We don't need them to go in and click them on. It'll just be okay. You know, like with our game, we have a embedded screen reader into the client. So basically, you know, native screen readers for the users. So it'll read all options menus, everything that they pick up. You know, I mean, we're a loot game, so you're picking up items with huge tooltips, and the screen reader will read everything out. It will read everything that you select, everything that you target, skills that you're using, like all of that stuff. But when we start the game, we actually default it to on. We provide a screen, basically a pop-up that notifies the player that your screen reader is enabled on. This, of course, reads out to the user. So we have players, you know, with, you know, that are visually impaired. they don't have to do anything. It's already reading all their content. They know exactly where they are in the menus, and it'll carry them through the game. If players don't need to do it, they can disable it right then and then not have it through the rest of their character creation. And we didn't actually ship with this. I had to patch in really, really fast at the beginning because I'm like, oh my God, we forgot to enable it on. But then we had blind players who were trying to get into the game, but they needed sighted help to find the option to turn on the screen reader. And I'm like, well, that just wasted all of that time that I spent making a screen reader. So, we hot fix this as soon as possible. That way, hey, now players start the game. It started on, and that's still technically an option. But, by setting those, really functional default use cases, we get players playing the game as quickly as possible. But again, players are in a very broad spectrum of where they're at and what their needs are. So, when we talk about what you want for your accessibility options, like, is really just as many as you can provide. I don't want to make an assumption as to where my user is in their life. And some disabilities are temporary. Like, I have buckets of children. I have 5 kids, but sometimes I'm holding a baby and then I'm playing with one hand. So I'm temporarily disabled. That's actually accepted by the US government as a temporary disability. So in those moments, being able to do things that, like, hey, I need to augment the sounds because I need to have certain things ring out, but I want other things to be quiet because I don't want the baby to be upset. Or, can I map things to one hand as opposed to needing my keyboard and my mouse at the same time? Like, those sorts of things are really, really important. But again, like, making assumptions as to what the player needs is a really slippery slope. So I like to provide as much customization to the user as possible so that they can flip all of the knobs and twist all of the levers and all that sort of stuff to find an experience that just works for wherever they're at.
But I love that thought that you put into, like, choosing which options are on by default versus not. Like, that is such good user experience. And I think that that's the core of what, accessibility by design is like, what is the core user experience that we're looking for? And how can we create even more options, knowing that humans are infinitely diverse and have infinitely diverse needs and disabilities. And we have to be able to accommodate for that in as many ways as we possibly can.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love a lot of what Drew was saying about, like, some of the the out of box experience. Like, when you go in there, there's actually, like, an interaction the player has with this like very critical setting, which is kind of, from my perspective, kind of the ideal of when you have an accessibility option. Like, can it be inline in the game? Like, for example, the player is taught how to control the camera. Is that a good time to say, like, hey, you can actually change your camera control? Do you need to invert the y-axis? I think of, like, Halo's tutorial there, where the NPC tells you to look up, and no matter which way the stick is pressed, it looks up, and then it saves that as your setting. Like, can these customizations be inline? Because a lot of what Drew was saying was that, like, oh, like, this player who needs the screen reader, they couldn't go into the menu themselves. And I think, like, to a less extreme example, settings menus and stuff, they provide, like, a cognitive load. So it's kind of a question of, like, are options, like, as equitable as developing as baked into the design, if there's a cost to the user to go into that settings menu? How many times have you heard of a player, like, complain about something in the game when there's actually a setting to turn that on or off? They just don't, and they didn't even look in the settings. Like, I have to imagine the number is really staggering. If it's baked into the design, those users are brought in too. And also baking it into the design is also going to have the most impact, right? Because most inclusive. No one has to go into the menu to turn it on to have that experience. So those are kind of the things I try to think about the most. But, to what Drew was saying, sometimes the options are really critical. Sometimes it's something that's in conflict with the core experience. You can't have that there. Like, I'm thinking about audio cues. Like, there's a lot of competition in the audio mix of a lot of games. So if you have the audio cues on by default, there might be, like, a creative conflict with how the game is supposed to sound and this and that. Having it as a setting allows players to opt in when they need that. So those are kind of the things that I think about with regards to, accessibility by design. Is this equitable? Is this inclusive? And then, when are options needed? Like, at the end of the day, options do bring more people in. they do help players who couldn't play the game before play them. So I think they have a lot of high value, but also thinking about where we can bring it into the design.
Yeah, and just thinking about the UX, right? Because like user interface, like you said, has such a high cognitive load in general, and like it's so difficult to make sure that it feels natural to use, comfortable to use, easy to process. All of these things, like that is such an important thing for us as game designers and also UX designers, on these games to be considering. Sorry, Drew, I didn't mean to cut you off.
One thing that you brought up, Adam, which I think is really important, is understanding what accessibility options fundamentally change what the core game is. Now, what I found is, like we have a lot of stuff where it's like, hey, well, this augments gameplay, or this changes the visual fidelity, or this changes the audio fidelity, and we have people who, well, this is my job to make X, Y, or Z as perfect as possible. And this accessibility option changes what that core directorial vision of the game is. And I'm like, yes, but it's an opt-in. So the app, or like the standard user, is going to come in and they're going to play the game and it's going to look exactly the way you do. And this feature is not diminishing this player's experience. It's allowing them to experience something that they otherwise would not have been able to. And that argument has actually been really great with me being able to explain to individuals who have a very, stalwart view of what the game aesthetic has to be, and be like, well, no. So this is, yes, maybe this is going to make the VFX look a little weird, but it's going to let somebody else experience the game who otherwise wouldn't have been able to play. And they're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm like, I know it makes sense. Let's make the game more accessible. Come on. But having that be an opt-in handshake, I think removes a lot of those barriers and makes people more accepting of changing what that moment to moment looks like.
Yeah, especially like by design within those options, right? As opposed to asking a player to have to like mod the game in order to like fulfill their own accessibility needs, where like you don't know what that experience is going to look like. But if you're providing that as the design team and making those choices for them, A, as Adam said, it reduces their cognitive load, and B, as the designer, you have an idea of what they're experiencing and you have a little bit more control over it. So if I can bring it back to that hand-to-hand wombat story that I brought up earlier, so hand-to-hand wombat, like I said, we designed around the idea that we knew that like low and no vision players, blind players, would be able to play this game, unlike a lot of other games that are on the market, right? And we also knew that we couldn't ship with Braille on the cards just because of cost of goods. Like in board games, that's such a important part of whether or not we're even able to make a game, right? So we had to acknowledge this is not completely accessible. How can we present to our players other ways that they can actually like improve on the accessibility of our game beyond even just players who can't see the board, or players who are in these particular realms of disability that we can envision, right? So we actually did a lot of accessibility play testing and learned from our players with all sorts of various disabilities, all the different ways that they would modify the game in order to accommodate their needs. And so we were able to take a look at that as designers and say, okay, this is something that I think we can absolutely make as recommendations for players who have, like basically like visual communication needs or motor disabilities or things like that. We can make this list of ways that they themselves can change the game on their own as recommended by the designers, so that they have less cognitive load to have to approach that process themselves. They don't have to sit there and think about all the different ways that they could possibly change it. They have a basis to start from. Even if it doesn't fully address all of their needs, they have a basis to start from as presented by the designers. And I think that that's something that we don't see very often in board games. We don't see very often in, a lot of the physical gaming spaces. But we, obviously we're starting to see a little bit more. And I love that we can see your kiddo. After you mentioned you have 5 of them, I was expecting to see more come through. Sorry for derailing. But like, as we're thinking about how can we design options in there aren't usually very many options for board games, right? We just say house rules, just figure it out with house rules. And that's fine, that's good, but that really respects our players to the point where we assume that they know how to develop their own house rules. But if we develop some baseline house rules for them, that at least gives them a place to start, right? So that's, from a board game perspective, that's where we're coming from with our options.
I really like that perspective, Carol, because it's like the quote unquote options that you can build into a board game can be really powerful because the board game designers are going to be understanding what the core design is. How do you provide this fun to players who need this need like a house rule, so to speak, because the players that play in the game aren't necessarily game designers, right? You might have like really robust control remapping, but they're not control designers. It might take them a really long time, or they never be able to find like a control mapping that's good for them. But if we know with these recommendations that you're building out, you can be like, well, here's, if you have this kind of disability, here's how you might be able to play this game and still experience the core fun of it. I really like that as an example of like kind of the parallels and options in our two mediums.
I think
it's been really powerful when we have customers email and say, hey, like, I love this game, but, and then we can just point them directly to this and say, hey, maybe try these different game modes, or maybe try increasing the timer or things like that, where otherwise, for previous games, we just didn't necessarily have those tools. And I'm really excited that we've been able to conceptualize how to build that sort of stuff out. Sorry, Drew, I didn't mean to talk over you.
That's, I mean, it's such a good point, right? Not everybody is a game designer, and sometimes they just want to play the game. So like, adding new control schemes, letting players rebind everything is awesome, but also providing, hey, but here's our recommendation. Like, that's critical, because not everybody is going to want to have to think through how to make the game work for them. So like, you're providing, hey, if this is an issue for you, here's a new way, or here's a new rule set that you can use to make the game more accessible for you. It's the same thing with our controls, right? Where it's like, hey, you know what? You're playing one-handed. Well, you can go and choose that option in our game, and we've made a good, a good viable control scheme for you. You can augment it further if you want. You can add more house rules, to that design if you need to. But fundamentally, we give you a great starting point to step in and start playing.
Yeah, it's basically as though the sort of design to options isn't a binary; it's a spectrum.
Exactly.
Where purely design involves no user input at all, maybe even going to the Halo camera example, where the user doesn't even know that they've made a decision, but they're still kind of within the levels of customization that a player can achieve in the game. There are still sort of like developer suggested, here are maybe the first sets of things you ought to look at, kind of as guideposts for how the user ought to go about customizing their experience, which I think is genius. And around Drew's earlier point, or do we need to move on, Carol? We got to move on.
Well, soon, yes. But I was going to say also that, I mean, like, again, pulling down the barriers, like we're just reducing the barriers more so by doing that, which I think is really great. But yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to get into the crunchy stuff that I put the pin in earlier, where we're talking about, like, what is this process? How do we work with our teams on this? Where do we, where do we get this like, how do we build this knowledge within ourselves, within our teams? What does that workflow look like? And how do we document it in such a way that, like, we're not the only ones holding on to this information or onto this knowledge when the next project comes up? Adam, I'll kick it over to you, since I'm the one who put the pin in you.
The pin in me. So I was kind of speaking to a little bit about the kind of championing and kind of communicating to other members on the team. Like, very typically, just like with anything, right? Like, not everybody is going to be really cued in on level design beats or the actual nitty-gritty of combat. Not everybody's cued in on, kind of the accessibility considerations or the unintentional barriers. So very often this means doing a little bit of education and being like, hey, hey, I noticed your work. I'm actually seeing that there might be an unintentional barrier. What do you think about it? Starting that conversation, being like, what about a player that has this kind of disability? How do we make them have a better time? In my experience, I've often had really good kind of results from trying that approach. versus like, oh, I see a problem, we need this feature. Because then now production's like, oh, we're getting a new feature? What do you mean? Like, but designers can actually be solving these problems and like considering those things. And kind of the other things is kind of like bringing accessibility into the processes of the team, right? In the same way that you would kind of evaluate design, you would evaluate, oh, this level, is this good? Is this meeting our goals? Do that the same with accessibility, like in the same way that we validate the design through things like reviews, playtesting, this and that. We can do that with accessibility in much the same way, bringing accessibility into the processes at the studio that are mature, very often mature at longstanding studios. The mature and have like criteria for how we evaluate success. Do the same for accessibility, right? That's going to be able to drive success in that realm as well. So that's just, I'd like to kick things off just with that bit. Anyone else would like to add?
I love that. Yeah, I mean, so for me, for my team, I've been so excited about making our games more accessible to more people, about bringing it to more audiences, that I really dove in to research and learning and self-education on this subject matter. And so I have actually built out a lot of documentation and done workshops with my team to explain these are the things that I'm looking for and thinking about. Like, this is why I'm a squeaky wheel in all these design meetings saying, hey, let's just make sure that we're dual coding that so that players who have, like colorblind needs are accommodated in this design, things like that. Like, this is why I'm thinking of that. I actually built out what I call an accessibility rubric. And obviously there's no way to tick every box, but I list out a lot of, common disabilities and questions that we can ask ourselves through the design process of, hey, can players communicate visually? Are players hands-free to be able to sign to each other, for example? Or do players need to stand up? Are there ways for them to be able to play while sitting down? Do they need to manipulate small objects? Are there ways that we can make that easier for them? Can we extend the timer in certain situations? Stuff like that, where we're just asking basic questions to ourselves so that we can start thinking about putting ourselves in other perspectives, thinking about other needs. And that has made a huge difference, in our team, just having the baseline questions to ask ourselves, and then we move into playtesting, accessibility playtesting with diverse audiences that show us what the real experience is, and then we adjust from there, right? Because nothing about us without us, right, is the mantra. Like, right. So always test with all of your players, but also try to anticipate so that even those first tests can potentially go very well, and they say, oh, this is great, except these are small things that I would change, which we've started to see, which is really exciting.
Yeah, for us, it's entirely about having accessibility be kind of the same level of member at the table as everything else the game does. It is one of the critical components of making your game like absolutely everything else you do. From a process perspective, we basically treat the pain points of our players from an accessibility perspective as being every bit as valid and relevant as everything else we are looking at that people dislike about the game. The overwhelming goal is to make the game as fun for as broad of a player base as possible, and that's kind of what we focus on. So it's both about making sure the player base and the community knows that that's our attitude about that, and at the same time making sure that our entire team internally knows that as well, making sure that nobody is thinking of our accessibility options as kind of a second citizen or as an afterthought is just as important as making sure the community is aware of it.
Yeah, really, that's super important. Accessibility, or making your game as accessible as possible, was a prime pillar for Diablo 4, for example. So like, I'm the lead accessibility designer. All I do all day long is ensure that our game is as accessible as possible. So I sit in meetings with the lead combat designer, and we're Diablo 4, and I have as much say as he does, in features that we need to be implementing in the game. And that's amazing, right? And I can't wait for that to be more commonplace in the games industry. So I'm embedded in every single thing, and I have just as much say in pushing resources to make sure that we're enabling more players to come into the game, just as much as the systems designers are trying to make new equipment. But it's really important, and it just educate. Like, I spend a lot of my time teaching the other leads about how to make their content more accessible, because then it means that all new things that we're making are just becoming better and better because they're already designing with those things in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great spot to end on, thinking about like, let's get more people who are specifically thinking about accessible design into the industry. Let's start thinking a lot more about like creating a space specifically to approach games from an accessible mindset. I think that's a really great place to stop. And we are actually at time. So I want to thank you guys so much for this conversation. I know I've learned a ton and I'm really happy to share my own experience designing in this space. And I'm so grateful to have spent these 45 minutes with you guys.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, everyone.